Morning everyone and welcome back. Today we are going to go over a pizza dough recipe. So this is a recipe I've been making for many years and a lot of people really enjoy it. It has pretty good flavor to it, and if you follow the methodology that we're going to do today, this applies to pretty much any sort of dough that you would do. So if you decide to make bread or rolls or any sort of breadstick or anything that you're going to make with dough, this is the process you would go through to make this very basic dough. So let's take a quick look at the recipe. So here's our pizza dough recipe. As you can see, it's very simple, only a few ingredients in there. And that's one of the beautiful things about making a pizza dough or any kind of dough that's going to give you some sort of bread, is that they share very common ingredients and they're pretty common. So yeast is the one thing you might not have on hand, but most people who do any amount of baking are going to have flour, salt, water, olive oil, and sugar available. So if you need to get some yeast and you're not sure if you're going to use the whole thing, just get those little packets of Fleischmann yeast. One packet is about a tablespoon, so it's a little bit more than you need here, but one packet will do the trick for you. Alright, so I have all my ingredients already measured out, and you don't see the salt because I already mixed it into the flour. I wasn't sure exactly what the tablespoon or teaspoon measure was going to be for the salt, so I had to weigh it out and then adjust the recipe. But in either case, I have my 18 grams of salt in here. I'm just going to grab my whisk and mix that up a little bit. So just want to make sure this is well mixed in. I don't want to have any salty patches. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm just going to set my flour aside for now because I need to work on my water and yeast. Right. If you're making this in a stand mixer, you're going to want to use the dough hook, which is the attachment that looks like this. Okay, having a stand mixer and using this will make it much easier and faster for you, but I know a lot of you don't have a stand mixer, which is perfectly fine. I'm going to show you how to do it by hand. So your first thing here, we're going to add our 450 mils of water into the bowl. Okay, and I'm using this really large bowl because I'm eventually going to add the flour into here, and I need to have a large area to be able to mix it so I don't spill a lot of stuff over the side. So 450 mils is just short of 2 cups. So each cup is 250 mils, so 2 cups would be 500, so you just need a little bit less than that. Okay. If you don't have a glass measuring cup, what you could do is just pour or measure out 2 cups of water using a 1 cup measure, and then just scoop about 3 tablespoons out, and you should be okay. Right, so now that I have my water, I also have my 2 teaspoons of yeast, and what I'm going to do is just try and sprinkle this on top, and I want this to not clump up too much, because then it's more difficult to try and mix this in. Alright, so I'm trying to create a relatively even layer on the top, and the water is going to start moistening this, and hopefully the yeast will start to sink to the bottom. Yeah, at this point I usually just let it sit. I try not to stir it too much because anything I use to stir it with is going to have yeast attached to it. So one of the things I do instead, though, is if you have a spray bottle, and these come in really useful if you're going to be making any kind of bread, I just spray the top a little bit to try and add some moisture to the top, and it also forces the yeast down to the bottom. Okay, you can see it sinking down now. So what I'm going to do is just let this sit for about 2 or 3 minutes so that it'll activate, and then I'll come back and mix in my dry ingredients. Right, so it's been a couple minutes and the yeast is pretty well dissolved. So you can move it around, you can see a little bit of a cloud in there, which is good. I don't have any solid granules anymore. So what I'm going to do is mix in the rest of my ingredients. Okay, so to do that, I still have my 1 teaspoon of sugar. I'm just going to throw that in with my flour mixture. And I have a wooden spoon that I'm going to use for stirring, but I'm actually going to use the bottom end of it. And that makes it a lot easier to clean and get the dough off, because it does tend to get a little bit sticky at first. Okay, so let's mix that in a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to put my dry ingredients in, and to that I'm going to add my 1 tablespoon of olive oil. Alright, so I'll just use the bottom end and just stir that in. Make sure you have something relatively tough to mix with, because this dough is going to get very tough to work with. So at the beginning it's easy, but as you start mixing more flour in, you can see it's starting to get a little bit more tough. So I have some stuck on here, that's okay. Using that end makes it a lot easier to get off. So at this point I'm getting mostly mixed in dough. It's a little bit furry. So what I'm going to do is just mix it by hand now. So if you ever get the dough stuck to your hands, like so, just rub that off. Okay, so the friction between your hands will just peel the extra dough off of your hands. Okay, so just mix that up. And the best way to do this, I find, is to use the kneading motion. So we'll just fold over and push it down. So this is going to be a little bit similar to when we were making the tortillas. Okay, and here it's very, you can see it's very sticky. I'll turn that over and use that to try and get the rest of the flour. So anytime you find a sticky spot, use that to try and mop up some of the flour in the bowl. So I want to get as much flour as possible. With baking, a lot of things are a very specific formula. With bread, it's a little bit different. Okay, so that's pretty clean. Just gonna take that out. Bread's a little bit different in that the main ingredients are pretty much just flour and water. Okay, so as it ends up, if it gets a little bit sticky when you're done the kneading process, you need to add a little bit more flour. If it is too dry, you need to add a little bit more water. Now I can feel already this dough is pretty soft, but it's also very sticky, so I'm going to have to add a little bit more flour to it. I have my flour bin, so I'm just going to use about my 1/4 cup scoop. Just add about a 1/4 cup at a time, just to see how well that works as I start to push that in there. Okay. Also, it's nice to have the flour on the surface because it becomes instantly less sticky, and I can now get this extra dough off of my hands. Okay, so once you get that, you can start kneading again. Okay, remember, turn, fold it in, turn, fold it in, and you don't have to do this fast. You just have to have a nice steady motion. Remember that you want to keep turning it. So you want to work the gluten from a variety of different angles so that you create a very strong matrix. Since we're making pizza, you definitely want to have a strong dough. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to have a nice crust when you're done. Okay, so I'm just working some extra flour into the dough right now, and I just want to mix this until it gets nice and smooth. Okay, so I feel like this extra 1/4 cup is going to be just right for us. I'm not going to have to use it all. It's starting to take on the right texture. Okay, as you work with dough a little bit more, you'll start to get a feel for it, so you know how sticky it should be, and you'll also know how soft, and get a feel for the right texture. Yeah, it's still a little bit sticky. There, and we're pretty much done. Okay, so it says to mix it until it has a nice smooth texture, and then when you poke it with your finger, it'll spring back. The dough will spring back, not your finger. So here's my dough. When I poke on it, you can see that it pushes back. Okay, that's what we want to see. And at this point, we're good. Now I just have to let it rest. So I'm going to get a greased bowl and put this in here. Make sure you cover it with plastic wrap. The last thing you want is for this dough to dry out, because then it won't be usable. Okay, so get a bowl, cover it in oil, put this in, and then cover that in plastic wrap. And then just let it rest in a warm place until it doubles in size. Right, so if you have one of these, this is your best bet to clean up your flour. So you want to just scrape your counters down. And you want to get rid of as much flour as possible before you wipe this off with a cloth. Okay, so remember that once you add moisture to flour, it becomes very sticky. And if you just wipe down the counter with all this flour on it with a wet cloth, it's just going to get all gummy and stick to your cloth, and it's going to be way more difficult to clean. Okay, so this is just my scrap flour here. I'm just going to throw this in the garbage. Okay, and then I can wipe the rest of this down with a cloth. Okay, and there shouldn't be very much sticking to it because there's not a lot of flour. Right there, nice clean. So now I got my bowl. Just going to spray that lightly with oil. Put my dough in. And then I'm going to cover that with plastic wrap. Okay. So I'm going to put this in a sunny area just so it'll be warmer and it'll rise faster. So just so you guys have an indication, this is what we're starting with. So then you'll be able to see what it'll look like once it doubles in size. The dough has doubled in size. It's been about 2.5 hours, so it does take a while for this whole process to happen. So once you get to this point, you just want to take it out, and we're going to degas it a little bit. Okay, so just push some of the air out of it, and then we're going to separate this up. So this recipe is supposed to make 2 large size pizzas, but you can actually make some smaller ones if you want instead, especially if you don't have any pizza pans to work with. So I'm going to separate this into 3 pieces instead of 2. And if I wanted to be really accurate about it, I would just get out my digital scale, measure the full weight of it, and then divide it by 3. Here I'm just going to do a rough cut on it. So there. Right, so all I want to do now is turn these into some dough balls, because I'm going to have round pizzas at the end. So like we did last time, just take your dough and fold it over and pinch, hold, pinch, and just keep going through this process until it gets smooth on top. So you can see it's quite smooth here. So I'm just going to bunch this up here and bring that together. Okay, so that's my first one. Instead, if you wanted to, if you've been practicing that movement, so by rolling it on an angle, you're able to smooth out the top. Okay, so this is a little bit similar to what we did with the tortillas, but these are going to be bigger. So what you want to do is just kind of push down on an angle, so it's kind of creating a little bit of a point. If you keep doing that, it'll eventually just pull itself together. Okay, so even if you start to develop a little bit of a tail, it's fine. At the end, just push that in and you have a round. Okay, so again, just push it on an angle, and you want to try and tuck that in a little bit at the end. Okay. Okay, so that's our third one. All I'm going to do with these, I'm going to let them rest, but I'm also going to cover these with plastic wrap. Actually, actually. First, I'm going to put a little bit of oil on there. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of olive oil and just coat the surfaces a little bit. This will make it a lot easier for me to get the plastic wrap off when we're done. Okay. Surface number 1. Number 2. And number 3. So these don't really have to rest for a long time. At this point I can probably roll them out in about half an hour or so. I just want them to rest a little bit and relax the gluten. That'll make it much easier for me to roll out. Okay, so once you get to this point, just let it rest for about 20 to 30 minutes. It's been a good amount of time. The dough is nice and relaxed. You can see it's nice and puffy now. I don't need all 3 of these, so what I'm going to do is take one of them and just put that into the freezer. So first I'm going to get rid of any gases again. So you can see the difference in size once you degas them, but I'm going to store this one for later. One of the nice things about pizza dough is it does freeze very well. So if you realize that you have more than you need, just store them into a Ziploc bag. Get rid of as much air as possible. You don't want it to get freezer burnt, and then you can just store that. So with my remaining 2, I'm going to show you how to do it both with a rolling pin and also how to just use your hands. So I'm going to get this one out of the way real quick. Okay, so we'll work with this one. One of the things that I do need is this bin of flour. So I need to have a lot of extra flour just to make sure that it doesn't stick to the counter or stick to the pin or my hands or anything. I want it to be able to move around very easily. So just start sprinkling some flour on top and then underneath. Okay, you want to have it nice and coated. First thing I want to do, I'm just going to start degassing this, so I'm going to press down on that. Okay, you can see right now it's moving very well, and that is because we let it rest that whole time. Okay, so give it some good pokes with your finger and try and get as much of the gases out as possible. Now you can see already at this point it is spreading out really well. What you want to do if you're doing it by hand, take your hands and then just thin it out and move section by section and just stretch it by hand. Right? You don't have to get too carried away, just gentle stretches is good. Okay, after a while you'll be able to feel where some of the thicker parts are. Okay, so here I feel it's a little bit thicker, so I'll try and stretch that out. Right, and back here, same thing, still thick. And you just want to work on the edges first. Okay, if I started doing this in the middle, it would be a lot harder to work on the edges if the middle was thin and the edges were thick. Okay, so at this point, the edges are nice and thinned out. So what I'm going to do is work on this area in the middle. So I'll pick it up again. I'll just keep my hands underneath, and I'm going to use that to try and stretch out the middle. Okay, turn and stretch. And this is basically what they do in those pizza places when they do it by hand. You're just using your hands to try and stretch the dough. And you move this around to try and get to any of the thick parts. Okay. So there we go. Should be nice and thinned out and flat. Okay, so now I'm just going to put this on one of my pizza pans. Okay, so this is about the right size. The one thing I am going to do, because I don't want it to stick, and it has happened before, so all I'm going to do is get a little bit of oil onto this pan. So I'm going to use spray oil. You could also use olive oil or canola oil or anything, and I'm just going to give that a light coat. Right. Now, if you've ever been to Domino's, you probably noticed that they have cornmeal on their dough. If you wanted to add that in because of the texture, you can just sprinkle a light coat on the bottom before you put your dough on. Right. Now that that's sprayed, I'm just going to pick this up and lay that on. Okay. So it doesn't quite fit. So all I'm going to do is now bring this in and just make sure that it fits the pan well. Okay, I can always redistribute the dough as I go along. See, it's a little short here and too much on this end, so I'll just pull some of that out to help with that side. Okay. So you want to give yourself a good amount along the edges, because that's going to be the crust that you're going to pick it up with. Okay, there we are. So it's nice and fitted in right now. So I'm just going to let this rest while I do the next one. Okay, and I'm going to do the second one on a cookie sheet. So in this case, I'm going to go for a rectangular shape on it. Okay, so put that on there, throw a little bit more on top. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to degas it, but you'll notice that instead of keeping it round, what I'm going to do is start to force it into more of a rectangular shape. Okay, so I can start doing this with it instead. And dough is pretty tough. I mean, I can pick it up and stretch it out this way a little bit if I wanted to try and already start working it into that shape. Okay, so it's getting a little bit tough right here, so I keep stretching back. I will pull this out a little bit more, and then I'm going to let it sit for a minute. So with your rolling pin, make sure you have a good amount of flour on there as well. This one is silicone, so it works really well. While you're waiting for this to relax, set your oven. I set mine to 450 degrees. You want it to basically go in anywhere between 450 and 500 degrees. Okay, 500 is a really good point to put it in, although it does tend to get a little bit hot, and if you have anything in your oven that has spilled down, it's going to burn really bad. So 450 is probably good. It'll take a little bit longer, but it's more of a safety thing in that if you're not watching your pizza the whole time, it takes longer for it to cook, so it's less likely to burn before you check on it. Okay, so with my rolling pin, I have my two directions. So here, we'll stretch it out, and then as it's stretching, I'm going to work the back part here to try and turn that into a rectangle. Okay, so same thing here. And it's already roughly in the same shape here, but the dough's a little bit thick on this end, so I'm just going to keep pushing that side out. Okay. And it doesn't have to be a perfect shape, you know, if you get it roughly rectangular, or even if you had a smaller circular shape on there, that would still work out well for putting it onto a cookie sheet. You just want it to be able to fit the whole thing. Okay. So that's pretty good. Having a nice long rest period does help in making it easier for you to roll your dough out. Okay, just remember that with your rolling pin, you can roll the whole thing at once, or you can use it to try and target certain areas. Okay, so I'm using this to try and pull that part back, same over here, and then a little bit in the middle as well. Okay. Great. I'm just going to put that dough onto this cookie sheet. So since I have a liner on here, I don't have to worry about it sticking. Just put that up. Put that on. Right. So if you don't have any liners and you don't have any parchment paper, which is going to be the next best thing, just put some oil on there just to make sure it doesn't stick for you. I'll let that one rest as well. And now that we're done with the flour, again, make sure you gather all that together. and toss all of this out before you wipe off your counters. Now the time has come to dress the pizzas. So as I said before, you can do whatever you want with it. I'm going to put some tomato sauce down on mine. You don't have to use tomato sauce. A lot of people that I know have put on just olive oil or an Alfredo sauce or barbecue sauce. You can put whatever you want as your base layer here. You could just put nothing down if you wanted to. So I enjoy the flavor of the tomato sauce on here, so I'm just going to put a fairly light layer on. Okay. Be careful how much sauce you do put on though. If you put a lot, then it's going to be really saucy, and it can make the bottom a little bit wet even when you're done baking it. So this is probably pretty good. And then after that, I'm going to put on a layer of cheese. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of Parmesan. So I'm just using the Kraft Parmesan. It's okay. It doesn't have a ton of flavor to it. So if you can find some real Parmesan or Grana Padano that you have, that's in a block that you have to grate, that has a very good flavor, and that's what you'd be best with using. If you just have this, it's good. It still has more flavor than the mozzarella cheese, so it'll add a good flavor to your pizza. So afterwards, let's put a little bit of mozzarella on top. I don't need to have a ton. I just need to have enough so that it'll help glue down all of my ingredients. Okay, you can put as much or as little as you want on. If you want it really cheesy or just make a cheese pizza, feel free to really fill it out. Okay. See, for me, that's probably good. And I'm just going to do a Canadian pizza. So with the Canadian, you have to put on some mushrooms. So I try and cut these very thin, just so that they'll cook easily and kind of crisp up a little bit around the edges. Okay. Alright, so there's my mushrooms. I also have some pepperoni. It's slightly frozen because I keep it in the freezer just so it'll last a lot longer. But the nice thing about pepperoni is it does come apart fairly easily, even if it's frozen. Okay. And you can put a lot of pepperoni on if you want to. One of the things you'll notice when it cooks is that it does shrink down quite a bit. So even if this top was completely covered and they were very close together, by the time you get to the end when it's fully cooked, there's going to be lots of spaces in between. Okay. Alright, so there's my pepperoni, and the last thing I have is some chopped up bacon. So I'll just sprinkle a little bit of that on. Okay, and try and even things out as much as possible. You're going to be eating this in slices, so you want to try and make sure that every slice has some of the ingredients on it. Okay, I'll just throw a little bit more cheese on top, just to help glue these little bits in. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to throw that into the oven to bake. I'm already at 450 degrees, so I just have to cook this until the bottom starts to get brown. So while we're waiting for the other pizza to finish up, we can start working on the second one instead. So now that it's nice and relaxed, I should be able to adjust the shape a little bit to make it a little bit more rectangular. So just like so. Can bring this down a little bit and then just smooth these out. There. So now it is a much more rectangular pizza. You just have to wait for the dough to rest a little bit to try and relax it, and then you can reshape it to however you want. Okay. So for this one, I'm going to go a little bit light on the sauce. Yeah, that should probably do. I just use the back of the spoon to move that around. It's a nice smooth surface, so it won't get caught on the dough. It'll make it really easy for you to move it to where you want it. There. Okay. So now that's on there, I'll start off with another layer of cheese. Okay, again, I don't need too much. I just need enough to really have a nice layer of cheese on the bottom, and also to help glue those ingredients together. Okay, I don't want everything falling apart as soon as I cut a slice and try and eat it. There, just throw the rest of this on here. There's a little bit of cheddar in here, but that's okay. I do enjoy the flavor of cheddar. There. Okay. So this one I'm going to have a lot of vegetables on it. So I'm going to start off again with my layer of mushrooms. Just move those around. Okay. After that, I have some chopped up yellow bell pepper. Sprinkle those on. I also have some artichoke hearts that I've sliced. Okay, so just make sure that you're spreading these things out. You don't want to have too much of it in one area and then another area that doesn't have any. Okay, so let me move this one over here. Go. I also have some sliced green olives, so I'll put some of those on there. So I find with these that it's a little bit easier to just try and pull some of these into a bowl and then pull them out of the bowl. I don't want to stick my fingers into the container, because then whatever's on my hands is going to be in the jar now and it's going to be sitting. So it should be enough. So I'll sprinkle some of these on. As I said before, this is your pizza. If you don't like olives, don't put olives on. And yeah, you just put on whatever it is that you like. And the last thing I'm going to put on is the pepperoni. Okay. I like putting the pepperoni on top just because it tends to get it a little bit more crisp. And it's nice having a good crisp pepperoni rather than having it wet and, you know, not quite as cooked. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little bit on here. There we go. Okay. So the other pizza has been in for, I don't know, about 4 or 5 minutes now, and it's on the bottom shelf. So what I'm going to do is put this one on the bottom shelf and then put the other pizza on the top shelf. That'll make it so that the bottom of the other pizza doesn't get too dark before the top of it gets cooked. So I'm at the point where it should be pretty much done. This is what it should look like on top, nice and brown. I mean, I'm sure you guys have eaten pizza before, so you know what it should look like. Just make sure that when you do this, check the bottom. You want to make sure it's nice and brown, so you can see there's a good browning on the bottom there. So all I'm going to do is use my flipper and put it onto one of my cooling racks. Okay, that'll make it so that this will cool down nicely, but it won't get moist on the bottom because of moisture being trapped in between the layer. So once this is fully cooled down, I'll put it onto a cookie sheet, and then I can cut it up with a pizza cutter. So if you have a pizza cutter like this one, that is going to work the best, because you just have to press down and then move across. You know, even if you have a pizza cutter like this will still work, even though the blade's a little bit smaller. And same thing, push down and then cut through. If you don't have a pizza cutter, it's perfectly fine to just use whatever knife that you have on hand and just cut through. And that's it. Go ahead and enjoy some pizza.